Good morning everyone and welcome to today's meeting of Economy, Infrastructure and Communities. Today's date is the 7th of January 2025. Happy New Year everyone. Hope you all had a good Christmas and survived New Year. The first item is apologies. Debs.
Yes, Chair, we have apologies from Councillors Chris Gronjick and Hudson. Councillor Tagg is joining us online due to traffic incident.
Thank you. Any declarations of interest from members on anything that's on today's agenda? I think we're probably all interested in today's agenda. Minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of November 2024. Thank you, Councillor Smith. I can have a seconder, please. Thanks, Pippa. Okay, so today's item 4, is flood risk management strategy. Over to Darryl and team. Oh, Simon's online. Sorry, Simon. Are you with us?
I am. Thank you, Chair, and Happy New Year to everybody. Sorry I can't be with you in person. As I say, give apologies because of traffic problems on the D Road. I managed to divert into Newcastle, Castle House, so I'm here coming in on Teams. Joining in the room is Darryl Ayres, James Bailey and Jamie Cooper, our Flood Risk Management Officer. And he's got a presentation which he'll be presenting in a minute, giving you an update on the Flood Risk Management Strategy Action Plan and also the FAIR project, which of course is Flood Awareness Information.
Councillor Tagg, you're on mute.
All the way through, you did nothing at all?
Just your introduction.
Okay, I don't know why it went on to mute then, but yes, so purpose of this report is to give you an update on the Flood Risk Management Strategy and Action Plan, and also an update on the FAIRS project, which is Flood Awareness Information and Reaction. And Jamie's got a presentation which I'll hand over to him in a minute. I think it's part of his presentation will update us on the recent flooding issues that we've had in the county and how we've managed to bring in money from the government and national authorities to be able to help people to alleviate the flooding as well. So without further ado, before I go back onto mute by accident, I'll hand over to Jamie to give the presentation. Thank you, Chair.
Good morning, committee. As Simon's introduced, Councillor Tagg, I'll give a presentation now. It's on a flood risk update for the past year. And the slides on. Okay, some of you might struggle to see that, I'm sorry. I thought first of all it's probably a good idea just to give you an overview of what the County Council is as a lead local flood authority. We are a lead local flood authority because of the introduction of the Flood and Water Management Act in 2010, which issued some powers and duties for different local authorities. Being a first tier County Council, it falls on us. The Environment Agency mostly cover main rivers. We cover surface water flooding, ordinary watercourse flooding and groundwater flooding. So we're the sort of smaller branches in a tree of a network of a river branches, if you like. The Environment Agency cover the main rivers. We did quite a lot of partnership working with various different authorities. So the Severn Trent Water, Environment Agency, Highways, National Highways, Canals and Rivers Trust. There's various different bodies that look after flooding with various functions. As I said, ours is more around surface water, ordinary watercourses and groundwater flooding. But we do lead in certain areas, and one of those is for flood investigations. So whenever there's flooding, which we set out the parameters for in our strategy, mainly where there's 5 properties or more, we will do a formal investigation which looks into the nature of the flooding, the different organisations that are responsible and have different functions, and trying to coordinate actions to ultimately help with that flooding. We also have a statutory duty to look after planning applications. The planning application side that we look after is in relation to surface water flooding. So you may have looked around the county and see ponds, large ponds on new developments. That's a result of us looking at those planning applications. Key thing is to make sure the flooding isn't worse for anybody else and that the development itself is okay. Perhaps the most interesting bit is that we get funding from various bodies, mostly central government, but also regional government things. for schemes, which are flood alleviation schemes. So these are physical things mostly to help with flooding. And then lastly, we also do with consenting and enforcing on ordinary water courses. So the smaller water courses that you see, we also do some regulation around that. Those functions are all mostly looked after by my team, which is the flood risk team. So just as an introduction. Okay, I thought it'd be, obviously it's probably a hot topic, especially at the moment, given the flooding, if you've seen the flooding out in Stafford at the moment. So I thought it'd probably be good to give a recap over the flooding that we've seen recently. We are seeing more and more floods. I think that's becoming clear. October 2023, Storm Babbitt. We have 96 officially reported properties. I must stress that these are officially reported, so the actual numbers, a lot higher. These are only ones who have officially got them. January 2024, Storm Henk, 71 properties. September 2024, 19 properties. November 2024, Storm Bert. We've had about 10 properties so far, and obviously we'll probably have some more on the floods that we've had over Christmas and over the weekend just past, which we're busy with at the moment in response stage. The other thing that's probably new since the last committee, well certainly for Staffordshire, is that the government issued these flood recovery frameworks. So that's a suite of programmes to help with recovery to properties. It's things like grants that they get, and we're administering some property flood resilience measures for those properties. So that's things like flood gates, flood doors, and they're going through at the moment. So whilst we're doing that, we're still responding to flooding, which is kind of how it seems to be at the moment. If you remember last time, we updated our local flood risk management strategy. That was published in February 2024. I've included an annual update to this presentation, and I'm seeking some views to publish on the website. So there's an update to that. There's an action plan at the back of that, which has been updated to review progress. I'll go through some of that in any case on this presentation. Key points to note from that is that from our planning application side, review planning application for surface water, 95% consultation responded on time, so we're hitting the target for that. We've issued a Section 19 report. A Section 19 report is an investigation to flooding for Tutbury in June, July 2023. And the Section 19 reports for Storm Babbitt, I think, have been issued, and we're due those quite soon for Henk, early 2025. The next thing I wanted to update you on is on our schemes. So these are flood alleviation schemes primarily that we look after. Various funding sources that we have for that. So it's mostly central government funding. It's called Flood Defence Grant and Aid. But we've also got quite a few other funding sources, regional, local levy funding and some private funding as well to help with those schemes. The current 6-year programme so far, so this runs from 2022 to 2027, it's always a 6-year programme. So far we've delivered 4 schemes. We have approximately £2 million of funding, and that's helped reduce the flood risk to 149 properties. In the rest of the 6-year programme, we've got an ambitious target of 22 schemes, 12 of which we've started. We've got £4 million funding, and the prospect for that is 682 properties. Future programme we've also looked at beyond 2027, which is 9 schemes, 810 funding, 407 properties, and we've started some of those already. So we can keep a tab of those as we go through. I thought it would be useful just to do some benchmarking on the, we all report to, there's various councils that report to the Trent Regional Flood Coastal Committee. Most of the stuff in Staffordshire is on the Trent. And we have an ambitious programme. So some benchmarking here. I'm not sure if you can see the figures, but I'll read them out. So Staffordshire County Council, we've got 3. So this was a report issued, I think, July from the RSCC's previous one. So these numbers are from there. We've got 333 properties better protected, targeted. Authority A, 114. Authority B, 62. Authority C, 92. And Authority D, 166. So it's just to give a benchmark that we're doing all right. There's a few more there than the other county councils or Birmingham City Council. We've also got quite a few schemes on the back of this flood recovery framework work, and also from the FAIR project, which I'll come on to in the presentation now. So the title, I think, of this original scrutiny committee was an update to the FAIR project. So the focus now will be on that. This FAIR project has got quite a lot of partners. The funding came from the Environment Agency in DEFRA, and we put a bid in a couple of years ago to attract this funding, which we successfully got. So we're the only one in the Midlands to have this funding, and it's all about innovation and community work. Okay, so those are the two key. If nothing else, just take home that this is about innovation and community work, and there's various partners which are on that screen that we're working with. Now, again, you may struggle to read this, but if I can just, this is an overview. It's a framework, really, of what we're trying to do. Really, I see this as a blueprint of the work that we want to be doing in the future, okay? And there's two strands to it. So there's a generic approach to the whole of the area, which is about a one-stop shop for flooding, and that's a website, effectively, for people to go and have a look at for communities at risk. There's a part about improved phone communications and infrastructure. I'll go into all of these in detail in a minute, but forecasting and warning for fluvial and surface water flood risk, and then machine learning, which is a bit of stuff around artificial intelligence, around screens. This is the stuff that we can do along the whole of the county so that we don't have to get right into communities and engage with them, okay? Because that's difficult to do in a short time across the whole county for all those communities. That said, there's also a targeted approach for the most at-risk communities that we're doing, and for each of those, we've identified those locations now. We'll be doing a risk assessment for those. There'll be a range of community types that we've selected in those, and then we've got funding for small-scale innovations for those communities, and it's all about bringing them together, having a community plan, and then having actions that they can do, working with the authorities to lessen the burden of flood risk in those areas, bringing innovation into it. So this is a framework of how I think lead local flood authorities could work in the future, and I'm trying to bring this up in the team to see how we can do that. So talking about that whole area approach, breaking down these individual things now. So there's a website that we've launched now. It's called fairflood.org. It's a one-stop shop for people to go and have a look at flooding. I should have said this is for Staffordshire and the Black Country, so this is an area, this isn't just Staffordshire, we're working with the Black Country, which we have a collaboration agreement for. They can get live and static information, so if you go onto that website at the moment, hopefully you'll see a load of flood warnings that have been issued from the Environment Agency that get updated on that website. It's currently in phase 1 at beta stage, and it's going to be developed to bring in things like forecasting and live information on that website as this project develops. But it is live now if you want to have a look at that. The second thing is communications infrastructure. So that there was a committee of MPs in Staffordshire several years ago who suggested the thing that if you flood, there isn't really a number for you to call. You know, there's no one agency to call. You've got the Environment Agency looking after the main rivers, you've got Severn Trent looking after sewers, you've got ourselves looking after one, and for those people who aren't used to it, it can be a bit of a nightmare. So the idea behind this was to have one call, one number that you could call, and we're looking into that, and we're working with consultants at the moment to see what the options are, and they've scoped up some options, and we're developing that. This isn't going to be easy because all the calls come in at the same time with flooding. So we're just figuring out how we can use, automate that to some extent, given the funding requirements that may be needed. The third thing is forecasting and warning systems. So there isn't, at the moment, if you go onto the Environment Agency's websites, because we're in the middle of flooding, you'll see that there's flood warnings go out and they get texts. People get texts if there's flooding from a main river. So if you live, on the Trent at the moment, you may have had a flood warning, or the Dove, to say that the community is at risk. That isn't the case at the moment for surface water flooding. Okay, surface water flooding tends to happen quicker. It's less easy to predict. That said, we're going to trial, and I must stress trial, and it will be experimentation thing with focus groups to see whether that's possible. So that's something that we're developing at the moment. There isn't in the country. There isn't such a thing at the moment anywhere else in the counties. In the local authorities. So this is something that we're trialling to see whether it's possible. And hopefully that'll give a bit of warning for those people at risk from the smaller types of flooding. The last thing is the whole area. So we've got a university on board, and they found really good results. So there's a trash screen there. What happens on trash screens is as the watercourses get loads of debris down the watercourse, they settle on these screens, and often it may be too late by the time that so crews got down there to sort that out because it's not safe to clear it. So what we've done is there's a university now who are looking at cameras, looking at screens to use machine learning to understand if they're blocked. So these cameras can look at that screen and see what percentage blockage the screen has. That can then send an alert out to the crews, if it's under a highway or whoever owns that screen, or to the communities to alert them, which gives a bit of early warning prior to a storm so that you can see where the priorities are. And that's working quite well. I think there's about 95% accuracy on that so far. The other thing that we've done on these is to introduce cameras, and I think we're trying to get communities to see those cameras as well so they can have a look. A lot of the time this is about anxiety with communities trying to know whether there's a flood. Being able to log on to something and have a look at it is a real bonus. And also for the crews. In the recent flooding, we've had highways crews look at those cameras and see what's going on. Okay. Now, the whole point of that machine learning, by the way, is to link it in with the forecasting so that we've got a much better early warning system for the floods that we experience. Okay, so this is the targeted stuff now. So this is really the stuff where we're going into the communities and working with those communities to help with flood risk. So we've selected communities. Again, so we've got Brood, Silverdale, Newton Lees, Church Eaton, Armitage, Mill Green, Kidsgrove, Tutbury, Norton Keynes, Waterhouses, Womben, Kitling Greaves, Hazel Wars and Endon. And we've also got a number of communities in the Black Country who we're working with. These are selected on areas at high risk of flooding and different types of community. So this is an experimentation as much as it is trying to help communities. We're seeing what type of things work for different types of communities. So there's a whole range of different communities here. There's funding for small-scale interventions. So some of the things that we have done, the first scheme that we did was at Norton Keynes Library. We've introduced some hydro-rocks there, made a rain garden, the library floods. There's a video on our website if you want to have a look at that. Explaining what that does. The key thing with this is that it's all about co-design. Okay, so we're working with those communities at the same level. They've got the experience, the local knowledge. We've got the expertise in flood risk. Bring it together, and we can design things with communities. And we're actively looking for new and innovative solutions. But because this is innovative funding, we're trying to find out different solutions. Stuff that maybe isn't being used widely and trial it. The other thing is a community plan. So with these communities, what they'll be developing is community plans. So they'll have triggers. So for example, at the moment, we've got Marchington where they do a road closure. And what happens is once the level gets to a certain point on the river, those communities have got some boards that they put up, some road closure signs that they put up. They've got authority, delegated permissions under the Highways Act. So they put those signs up and they're able to close the roads when highways are stressed. And that's worked quite well. And we'd like to roll that out, but for all different types of flooding and all sorts of circumstances. So that's a community plan led by the community, and we'd like that to be, sort of train the trainer so that the community keep that active. Some of this, as I said, this is also about experimentation. We've got the funding to try and do different stuff. So we've got numerous universities on board here to review what we're doing and see how successful some of this stuff is. A few of the key innovations that we've done so far, so I've talked about Norton Keynes Library and the Hydro-Rock. Hydro-Rock's a system that's really useful. It's a series of blocks that you can put to hold water under a highway, for example, or in a private space. And it's a bit like Lego bricks. So you don't have to work around services, you can mould it around it, which is the benefit of that. And it also has the ability to absorb water and then provide water for plants and things like that if you want a rain garden. So quite useful stuff. We're working with the National Flood Forum as well. They're a charity, so they're working in different communities at the moment, helping those communities, giving them advice. We've got quite a lot of technology brought on board as well, machine learning, flood forecasting, various different systems that are all from sort of basic engineering, back of the fag pack kind of stuff, all the way through to high-end modelling software. And we've also got a couple of PhDs that are working on this with us. They'll be doing active learning, so they'll be working with the teams and the communities to get some reviews on what we could do better and how it's worked. Another one that we've introduced recently is in Endon, Stafford. So this is some natural flood management. So you can see a series of ponds here that have been constructed. There's an aim to construct more of those. And what's innovative about those is that normally these things are tuned for smaller storms, but these are going to operate only in those bigger storms, because at the bottom end of Endon, that's where we get the flooding. It only kicks off when we get sort of much higher return period events, 50-year, 75, things that have only got a 2% chance of occurring in any year. And so we've tuned those to only collect that water. So they'll escape, the water will escape out of it, but they'll fill up in these bigger events, hopefully preventing the flooding downstream. And we've got cameras and monitoring on that to tune that. In terms of the forward look then, there's a programme of community engagement already started, so we've selected some of these communities and we're getting out there. There's some schemes that are hopefully, certainly by the next meeting, we can start showing you that they've already been designed, they just need to be constructed. We need to construct some of the interventions. The forecasting warning system is being developed. And that's going to continue. Again, hopefully something that we can start trialling. And then there'll be collaboration with other projects. So there's quite a lot of networking within this project, being a national project under the Environment Agency, to learn from other councils as well, which we'll take on board. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. And of course, any questions? Thanks.
Thanks for that, Jamie. It's quite apt that we've got this on our agenda today when it took me 40 minutes just to get out of Tamworth. Councillor Smith.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting driving here this morning to look at the massive amount of water that has been held on the fields, and so I do sympathise with you with the problem. I've got 6 quickies, if you'll bear with me, Chairman. Firstly, I've got a problem in my division, and I wonder how... I represent a very rural area. How do we cope with where we've got systems, highway drainage systems, that go to soakaways in fields where the soakaway can no longer cope with the volume of water that's coming off the roads? And I just wondered whether we had a plan to look at dealing with that. My second point was I'm very concerned about ditches that have got blocked up. I have a very small fund that may be able to help with some ditches in my division. But I wonder, I think we now have a fund for working with the agricultural community for how we can improve ditches, and I'd just be interested if you could tell us something about that. I've got a problem where I have runoff from fields, which I do understand that other people's water is not our problem, but once it gets onto the highway, it suddenly becomes our problem. And I just wonder how we are going to cope with particularly, I have 3 landowners that have got water pouring into what was normally a dry brook that now floods an area of the village, which is not directly our responsibility. So I'm interested in what we do as far as brooks are concerned. Then my last question was, when we start looking at the disposal of water, I just wonder whether we were making any progress with planning authorities in the use of grey water and the disposal of grey water. It seems to me we've got a lot of water we're not using properly. That's me, Chairman.
Over to you, Jamie.
Okay, now I've made some notes, so hopefully I'll cover this for you. Okay, so in terms of there's 3 points here that probably relate to rural ditches, soakaways, and agricultural ditches. The thing is okay, first of all, under highways, in rural areas, there's probably more machinery that goes down those tracks now than used to be. And what's happening is the width of carriageways is not as wide as it used to be. So some of those ditches are starting to erode, and that's because of the amount of traffic that's going down through some of the rural areas, and it's a natural degradation of those areas. In terms of the responsibilities, so landowners are actually responsible for the ditch, most of the ditches that are on the highway. There are enforcement powers that we've got to look at that, and we have acted on them. There's a bit of crossover here between the team functions. So there's a bit of crossover between the flood risk team. Our focus is mostly on property flooding. You know, that's where the focus is, and highways is to keep the highway safe. Okay, so there's two sort of functions that exist under the county. In terms of the work that we can do, so there is enforcement, and we're working with some of those community engagement teams at the moment to see how we can enforce some of those ditches where it's particularly bad, you know, to clear it. So there's a bit about that, about road ditch clearance, and that's also under the Highways Act. We do that. There's also a bit about the type of land as well that we're getting, the sort of flooding that we're getting. Okay, so we seem to be going through periods where we're getting prolonged spells of rain followed by intense rainfall. And what's happening in rural areas is certainly with some of the potato crops and things like that and the way it's ploughed, is that it's running off those fields more intensely than perhaps it used to. And so we're seeing quite a bit of sediment come down the system. We're also seeing quite a lot of runoff come down from agricultural land. In terms of you know, things that we have done, we have created in areas soakaways, and I know there's one in Cannock that we've done where we've put a sort of load of bunds on the edge of the field to prevent that, to hold back the water. A lot of that is working with the landowners because there isn't, whilst we've got enforcement power certainly as a county to do the ditch work, the landowner stuff is more working with landowners. We've talked to the different parties about this, about how to, you know, there are methods where you can till the land a little bit, and so it's working with those landowners on land management practices. So hopefully that answers the stuff about agricultural thing. I know you asked a question about soakaway systems. It's unusual to see a soakaway system from a highways thing to a field. Normally it's a ditch system that flows to a watercourse. You know, soakaways, but you can have areas where you get you know, ponds and things like that that naturally soak away into the land. Again, they depend on what the type of land is and how saturated it is. You know, so they're designed to function. Most soakaways are only designed to function in a relatively small events. When we get those bigger events, which we're seeing, you know, they're designed for a 5-10 year storm. When we're getting these bigger events, they're not designed to cope with that. Okay, the design standards at the time were not that sort of work. So it's about prioritising those areas and looking about, you know, where the highway has got a lot of traffic flow, where there's risk to properties, and it's about prioritisation.
Can you hear me?
Point. Is there any benefit in us talking to landowners about the direction in which they plough? I mean, one of the suggestions that we've had is that if the farmers that are causing a particular problem that I don't go into details on my local problem, but there's a suggestion being made that if they ploughed the opposite way, that it would stop the water flowing down, it would retain water within the furrows, and it would then soak away naturally and alleviate the problem. Is that actually a reasonable way to talk to the landowner?
Yeah, you can certainly do this strategically, and we have raised this with the NFU, you know, to talk as a strategic thing. We have done work on that. The issue, it also comes down to the technicalities of that land. You know, sometimes they will have to plough it a different way, or it's just the way that the tractor goes around that field. So the ideal, of course, is to have it lateral, you know, so that it's sort of rather than vertical, because the vertical will challenge it down, so you have it lateral. But there are added complications that farmers have to deal with other than that. So yes, you're generally right. It's just that there's nuances on the type of land where they might have to change it because they've done it, you know, already ploughed it so many times and have to try it a different way.
Thank you, Jamie. Councillor Ross, even. You've got a...
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yeah, there's something I've got quite a lot of interest in that many years ago I worked quite closely with flood resilience and flood resistance. And I've spoken to hundreds, if not thousands, of households and families that have been affected by this. And I think you can't stress just how impactful a flood is on a particular property, particularly where it's reoccurring, and the emotional effect and the life-changing effect it has on individuals, and also small businesses as well. You know, we're kind of focusing a little bit on properties here, but small businesses are also significantly impacted by this and quite often are driven out of business. And without going into local issues, I've got a few areas in my area where that is an issue. But I'm just interested to know, as a county, how many residential properties and businesses have we identified to have a reoccurring flood risk? How many we've been able to mitigate or to support up till now, and how many are in progress in terms of what we're going to do, or how many we're looking at to help so far? And then also, obviously, there's going to be presumably a number left over that currently we're not looking at, and what's the longer-term strategy in terms of helping these particular households to deal with this and to make them more resilient for the future? Thank you.
Yeah, so this is something that what the strategy focuses on in terms of the scheme side of it. You're right, and this isn't just about homeowners, it's about business as well. So that FAIR project that we've talked about is about, you know, businesses as well, and some of that flood recovery framework stuff that we've got. In terms of numbers of properties, so there's about, sorry, the exact number of properties depends on whether they're at, you know, fluvial flood risk, and I won't quote the numbers because if I do, I might muddle them up, right? So there's a total number at risk, but there's different agencies that look after that risk. Okay, so our focus in terms of schemes is looking at those that are at surface water flood risk, but sometimes those properties are also at, so, you know, we've got a few rural communities, for example, that are also at risk from the river. So they've got a double whammy. That makes sense. They've got surface water flood risk and a fluvial flood risk. In terms of tracking those numbers, so there was a slide earlier where we've done that and then benchmarked it just against other councils to see how we're doing. The prioritisation is about how many times those properties have flooded, whether there's recent flooding, and also whether there's, you know, whether there's a prospect of some flooding, but they haven't had it yet. So there's a whole raft of stuff that goes into that. You know, some proactive, but mostly it's, if a community has suffered repeat frequent flooding, then that's going to be a higher priority than a, you know, communities that's at lower risk of flooding. In terms of tracking that, then that's what's done in this update, you know, for the action plan is to provide that update then in terms of how many properties are better protected. It's a bit different because we used to just have schemes. Now there's various different things. We've got the FAIR project doing stuff. We've also got these flood recovery frameworks doing things. So there's various different streams. Sometimes the priorities change depending if the government issue a flood recovery framework. Then obviously we've got to set aside some time to do that and react to that because the funding's there. So there's a bit about opportunities here. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think you've highlighted one of the key things that I found most frustrating when I was dealing with this was that there's almost an ownership of water. And a water company would spend an enormous amount of money to stop their particular issue, but that property would still flood from a separate flooding source. And I know the local lead flood authority, the intention was to bring these organisations together so that rather than looking at it as your own sort of risk, if you like, that you work more cooperatively. And there was also, to my mind, a way of, you know, being much more efficient in terms of the cost of delivery. If rather than you all just trying to deal with your own problem and the household has still been flooded because you may have sorted out the fluvial flooding, but there's still a pluvial issue or a surface water surcharge, that it's no different to the homeowner. And that maybe there should be a more holistic approach. And I was hoping we'd moved a little bit more forward on that. And just on the numbers, I know it's always a moving feast, and I get that. And again, it's different authorities take different bodies take different risk. But just as a feel for a percentage, how many properties that we are aware of that are flooding in the county are we currently supporting, or have we helped, and how many are in the process of being protected, if you like, without going into specific numbers, but just to give us a feel for where we are and whether or not, you know, we're 90% into solving this problem or we're only just 5% in and dipping a toe literally in the water, just to give us a feel to where we are and where we're going, if you like. Thank you. That's fine.
I'll look into that percentage thing, so I don't want to say it here. So I'll look into that because there's nuance there, and I think we'll probably give you a better answer. In terms of that holistic stuff and the types of flooding that communities face, it's moved on a bit, fortunately, in the sense of the funding. So the way the funding works is that you get I think it's about double right? So if you just look at one source of flooding, you get half the funding. This is certainly central government rules. You get about half the funding that you would if you did it as a comprehensive thing, okay? So there's a lot more incentive, put it like that, to work with partners to solve these things. And we do work quite closely now with Severn Trent Environment Agency in particular. When Environment Agency lead on a scheme, if it's Main River, we will feed into that about the surface water risks and where do the pipes go and making sure that they've got non-return valves so it doesn't back up and what you're going to do with the water that can't escape into the Main River. And we've got quite a few schemes with Severn Trent Water as well. There's one now, Cheslin Hay, that area, quite a large scheme that we're working with in partnership. And certainly with those investigations, the purpose is to identify the risk management authorities that have relevant functions. Most of the time, the schemes come on the back of those investigations. So there's some stuff here about aligning priorities, you know, because if it's only a small amount, say, of sewer flooding, but most of it's Main River, you know, there's a bit of that stuff. But there is a lot more partnership working, and most of our schemes aren't just looking at one source. It's trying to look at the whole problem. There are a few because it can be difficult. But that certainly is more true. There's more partnership working. Yeah, thanks.
Any further questions? Connor?
Rightio, it's my favourite topic as well, Ross. I'll try and batch up some of these questions. One is on sort of civil contingencies and also that automation of responding to flooding calls. And I heard the word automation and my heart sank because I was like, if I'm in a desperate need to speak to someone, the last thing I want to speak to is a robot. I completely understand the resources that might be required in a large-scale flooding event. I absolutely appreciate that. But I just don't think it's worth going down the automated route, because I think you'll get more complaints and concerns about that than you will do if you just answer the phone properly, if you see what I mean. So I do think that we should carefully consider how that works. There may be some automation within it, but as long as you can speak to someone sort of at a second stage, that might be better. But yeah, that sort of concerned me. And that links into the kind of civil contingencies piece. A good few years ago, we had an issue in Burton-on-Trent where we were all concerned that the River Trent would overtop its flood defences. And that was because the flood defences were actually being increased in size at the same time, and there were gaps in that flood defence at that point. So one of the things that I remember well was looking at it's a boring conversation, but the Drakelow River Gauge, which is the river gauge just below the River Trent, upstream, as you might say. And it was quite obvious that that would overtop the maximum level that it had been forever. And that triggered me emailing the council saying, what the hell are we doing about this? Please, can we have a plan? One of the things that concerned me was that I personally, and nor have probably any of the other councillors in Burton, probably ever been briefed on the plan of action that needs to take place if those defences are overtopped. Residents were saying to me, well, where do you get the sandbags from? And no one could actually ever communicate where those would come from and who was responsible and who was leading on that. And whilst it may be, and it's probably the case that we do have significant comprehensive plans in place to deal with that, the communication of those is perhaps lacking slightly to residents and local representatives. Could we improve that? That's the question.
Thanks, Connor. So the first question then, which is about the automation, obviously I fully appreciate that. There's a lot of stress that goes into flooding. You know, most people want to talk to somebody, so I get that. And there's probably two extremes here, okay? So if we talk to our colleagues in the National Flood Forum, they'll say that, you know, you need to speak to people for half an hour on a phone to get to the root issue. So some of those conversations can be quite long, yeah? On the other hand, you've got the other end of the continuum, which is zero, you know, zero. And those two extremes are too far. So the question is, where do we bring it so that we have some human contact, you know, but try to bring us more. So we've got to do a cost-benefit thing here, you know, in terms of what's practical. But that doesn't just mean focusing on one thing. We're trying to think about, you know, is there a regional response to this? Is the pooling of resources that we can do, hoping that, you know, one area doesn't get hit so bad than another? So there's a lot of work going into that. And of course, because, as I said, the Environment Agency do have a flood line at the moment which covers main rivers, but there isn't anything out there in the country at the moment that deals with this particular problem at a local level. So it's just something that we're trying to spearhead to see what we can do. So there's a bit of fumbling around trying to figure out what, you know, that right response is, you know, and we've also got to think about the legacy of this as well going on. So we might have funding now, we've got to see how we sustain that funding into the future. So there's just some practicalities about that, you know, how we do it. But there's certainly the intent is to give people a better service than they currently have, you know, so that they get some information. So it's an improvement. The question is how well can we improve it realistically? And that's what we're trying to do. So that's the first point. In terms of the second point and the Burton thing, so I know when we had that incident in Burton some years ago, you're right, it was different because the flood defences were being built and there was a gap in there, but they had put a temporary stop in there, but there's a question mark about all that and, you know, how that worked. In terms of at least the practicalities of that, there was a lot of work done in preparation for that to make sure that the vulnerable people were going to be, you know, protected, that we've got, you know, routes in to get, you know, people out, where you're going to put rest centres, things like that, working with the local authorities. A bit of cross-working here. The local authorities set up the call centres. We've got to look after people in care homes and vulnerable people, you know, and certainly help coordinate that response with the resources that we've got. So that was all done. You know, I think the differences at that time was that, you know, they've got this setup where there's got a temporary bit in the barriers, and it was the timing of the two, you know, at the time. In terms of that flood risk at the moment, the Environment Agency have raised those flood defences quite considerably, and we've tested this in the flood that we had in Henk, you know, where it got the highest that it's ever been to, and we didn't experience any flooding. So there's a bit there about, you know, there's a reassurance that level of protection is a lot better than it was, you know, and that's the highest level, and the one that we've got at the moment is going to dip below that. So we're not the one that we're in at the moment. If you have a look at Draco Gauge, is a bit lower than that. In terms of getting that out to councillors and, you know, and showing what the response is, I think that's a very good point. We have done some work with schools and some of the communities before. We did some work with Tamworth and Burton trying to get that message out. Certainly widen that out to councillors and give briefing, and perhaps do some more on those community, you know, plans and what we do. As I said, the risk is much lower. That doesn't mean it won't happen. So when there are contingency plans at the moment, and we're strengthening those at the moment with a working group as well to see how we do things better in terms of response, you know, with the Environment Agency, local authorities, etc. But yeah, I take the point, and it's probably something I'll take back to that working group, you know, about how we can spread that message out to say what, you know, what the plans are. There's certainly certain things that we can do around that. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. I think Connor's right. And I have to echo that. If the first person that a resident is going to phone isn't going to be Staffordshire County Council, they're going to phone us. So we need to have that information. I remember 2007 when Fazeley flooded, and I happened to be coming off a night shift from where I was working at the time, and couldn't get through Fazeley to get home. And it just so happened that my husband was the mayor at the time. But that situation, I know a lot of work's been done around the Fazeley area with the flood defences, but there was no communication as to where do we get sandbags from, who do we call. You know, we need to have that information, you know, in a document to writ, so we can all just work together. And I suppose locally it would be our local authorities that would start that action, because they would have the action plan and they would know the chain of command, who's going to do what, and that is going to be documented somewhere. It's just where is it, so that we've got it to hand, because they're not going to phone the leader of the council. They're potentially going to phone us. So I do agree with you. I think that needs to come down, and we talked about that on the pre-meet, didn't we? I have got a question that's been sent in to me from somebody that can't be here today about on the slide about partnership working. Why is Stoke-on-Trent not there? Yeah.
Yeah, fair point. Obviously, it's not just Stoke. There's also other regional areas that we work with, you know, so at the moment all the water flows from Staffordshire into East Midlands, so there's a whole lot of, you know, boundary working. So certainly we've worked Stoke continuously, and that's true for others that connect to our county as well. So, yeah, sorry Stoke, but we definitely do work with you. Thanks.
Any further questions? Councillor Smith?
Yeah, can I just pick up on the point you were making about the flooding in Fazeley? Because at that time I was leader of Lichfield District Council, and the chain of command at that stage was that the chief executive of Lichfield District Council had responsibility for dealing with the whole of the flood risk and how we got the sandbags in and all the sort of things we did. But I gather that the chain of command has now significantly changed, and that's not a district council responsibility anymore.
Yeah, so it's the civil contingent. This is the civil contingencies area. So in Staffordshire, we have the civil contingencies unit that operate to work with all those different responders. When a flood's called, you get different commands. You get gold command, silver command, bronze command, and then different, you know, each individual authority will then have their own function that they deal with within that. Those tend to be operated by police or fire, possibly ambulance. So that's the coordinated strategic effort. And then you've obviously got the individual efforts within the counties that are led up, you know, tactical response groups and things like that, strategic response groups. They're all coordinated differently. In terms of the local authorities' response, I think the point is that if we did have a flood response, let's say it was Burton, they've got to lead on things like evacuation centres and get, you know, and finding rest centres and things like that. So there's probably a specific function for them that's quite important, you know, and that's where they'd lead on that. They'd be part of that network of partners that all work together in that effort. Thanks.
Thank you. Any further comments or questions? Connor?
Another topic, which is Section 19 investigations, which is I know Jamie and I have spoken regularly about these investigations, and it looks like there's been some improvement in terms of the timescale that it takes from the actual flood taking place and the actual investigation being completed and the report being published. Do you have any sort of up-to-date information about the timescales being taken for recent flooding events? I know you mentioned Henken. One of the other storms was due in early 2025, but back when we had conversations, it was around 2 years for an investigation report to be published, which I thought was not really acceptable, but there are resource problems with that. What is it like now? Sure. So, the aim of this is if a 12-month turnaround. So we're there or thereabouts. So the Babbitt ones are okay. The Henk ones, we're there or thereabouts, but they're due to be delivered soon. Obviously, we've sort of gone for a phase on this. So it's definitely improved, and we've got further plans to improve it with the way that we respond. What I must say with the Section 19s is, having looked at some others around the different counties, is we do tend to go quite intensely into these Section 19 reports and give quite a comprehensive response. We look at the nature of the flooding, the different partners, and we'll persist trying to work with those partners to get some answers. Some of us take a different approach where you sort of just get it out there and put the report together. We do tend to take that more comprehensive thing because it's there. And if the flooding happens again, it's a good reference article as to what the mechanisms are. So there is a bit of so I think we're there or thereabouts. We've got plans to make it better. There's guidance also coming in soon that we're expecting to formalise that process. And I can see improvements, and I can see us being really good at that, excelling in that. So I hope that answers the question. We're there or thereabouts, and it's getting better. Thanks. More on Section 19 investigations. I think in the action plan there was a mention of a triage process. And I should have it up in front of me now so I can talk about it. But can you just explain how that triage process will work? And if I can click on it myself, I'll tell you Yeah, so under the first objective, it's that says, one of the actions is to produce a refined procedure to allow fairer approach to triage flood investigations. And then it says largely complete, process outlined, etc. I was just wondering how that fairer approach might work and what the triage looks like.
Yeah, that's fine. So it's all about, you know, how many times is that? How many properties are flooded? What's the impact of that? So how many properties are flooded? Okay, have they flooded before? How often will they flood? What's the risk? You know, so if it's a 1 in 100 year, say, you know, 1% chance of flooding versus something that floods every 5 years, then clearly, you know, but there's also a numbers thing here. So if you've got, you know, 2 properties, but there's another one with 50 properties, it's all about that. But it's also about the nuance here is it always, the way these floods used to work is that you used to have a flood, you'd respond, you'd recover, and then another flood would come along. As you see in the sort of numbers that we're getting flooding, we're having a response phase, a recovery phase, and then another set of flooding with response and recovery phase. So we've got overlapping floods. So this triage is looking at what do we do, you know, and this comes back to your Section 19 report. What do we do if we've got a Section 19 report that needs to be produced in 9 months? But then that goes down the list, you know, in terms of doing it. And the way we've approached it is to pinch, essentially, the Manchester model that's used in hospitals. So if you go into a hospital, you're given a rank depending on the severity of your injury, you know, and it's the same kind of analogy because you go in and you've got to wait, yeah? And obviously if a person comes in and they need critical treatment, that goes straight up the list and the other one goes down, but there'll be a certain time limit to how long they can be looked at. So that it's around that model. Yeah. Thanks.
You finished, Connor?
If there's anyone else who wants to come in, do come in. I've just got a couple more questions, but is that okay? Sorry, it feels like my meeting now. Sorry. I was laughing when David says six questions, and now I'm doing the same, so sorry. Working with the sewer network and Severn Trent, essentially, in this area, there's an action that says work with developers and local planning authorities to secure appropriate connections to the sewer network. And in one of my areas, I don't want to dwell too much on local issues, but it seems quite clear that the sewer network has not been upgraded to the standard it needs to be to take some of the additional surface water flooding or surface water that comes off a development. What can we do as a local authority to try and put pressure on the utilities to upgrade their network before developments go in? And should that be done beforehand? I assume it should.
Yeah, so there's something that there's a piece of legislation that hasn't been enacted yet. Okay, and it's called Schedule 3 of the Floods and Water Management Act, which is the SUDS body. Now, there's an added thing in there, which is the removal of the automatic right to connect. Okay, and what that means is at the moment, there's an automatic right to connect to a sewer network. Okay, the planning process, so Severn Trent or any other water, you know, United Utilities, they're not a statutory consultee on a planning application. Okay, so they're not formally consulted. And they rely on us, in a sense, sometimes, to look at that planning application. Okay? One thing that we do when we go through the planning applications is to make sure that the applicant has done an application to Severn Trent for a point of connection. Because the problem is, if that's not done, and this has happened, there's a legal case in Welsh Water, okay, where a connection's made, and then there isn't enough time then, because it's up to the developer to then upgrade their system. Okay? So there isn't enough time then, if you don't do it with enough time, to be able to upgrade that system, because it could be a load of pipe work upgrades. So the way we deal it is 2 ways. One is when we look at the strategic housing land allocation sites and the strategic plans, is to look at those and see, okay, is there where's the water going to go? Is it going to be soak-away, watercourse or sewer? Are we aware of any problems? Can we flag it early? So that's one route. And the second route is to make sure that the applicant has applied to Severn Trent or United Utilities to make sure that they've done an developer inquiry, it's called, to see whether they can make a connection into a thing. Now, they can't refuse it, but it gives them advance notice then to be able to upgrade that network. Now, the regulation of water companies is with Ofwat. We're not a regulator of water companies, but that's how I see us fulfilling that role, to make sure that we're notifying as early as we can any potential issues. and then they can flag that back to the local authority if there are any. Thanks.
So there is essentially a little bit of a plan in place to
Yeah.
try and ensure that that doesn't happen. Okay, marvellous. And then finally, with working with Infrastructure Plus, Jamie's back in the room, so that's helpful. You know, it says that you have meetings to coordinate work, and that's ongoing now and embedded. And we talk about the machine learning and so on, about trash screens and all of that, and highway assets and so on. It seems quite common sense to me, and to many of my residents who say, why haven't you cleaned the trash screen or this out before the autumn, when we typically see heavier rainfall and more prolonged rainfall? Do we have a plan in place like that we go around the assets that we maintain before the autumn, especially when those assets are connected with potential flooding issues and so on? Is that something that we actually do?
Yeah, so the screens thing, yes, there is a plan to go and look at those things. The key thing is, though, you can do the best proactive maintenance that you want, but those screens depends on the catchment upstream. So when you get a storm that comes through, if you've got a rural catchment, for example, and all the leaves are dropping down, then what happens is as that water level builds up, it's bringing all the debris with it, and that's when it collects at the screen. So you can, you know, so the point is that the best intervention really is just before the storm or at the start of the storm, so that you can keep that monitored. And that's where I think the automated stuff can come on. And yes, highways crews can go out then and do it, but there's also a bit then about, you know, are there others around that can do that sort of work, or check the debris upstream to make sure that there aren't any big, you know, logs or something that could settle on that. So I think yes, it's working with highways, but it's also working with others as well. And as I said, you know, there's community stuff here, so the community plan could be check the watercourse the day before and see if there's anything in the watercourse before it settles on the screen. You know, so I think it's, to answer your question, yes, but there's more holistic stuff that we can do as well. Yeah.
There's an asset, I presume there's, in one of the actions, there's an update and improve asset register. Well, I've got a resident who is extremely active and, to be fair, has identified a wide range of problems across Burton, and he's just simply going down to small watercourses, looking at the infrastructure and basically pointing out all of the faults and putting it on social media, which is not necessarily that great from a reputation point of view, because it clearly shows that there are deficiencies in the resource to unblock certain gullies and areas and trash screens and so on. It says in the action plan that updating of the asset register is ongoing. Could you just sort of give us a bit of an update as to how that works in practice? Thank you. Sure,
yeah. So I mean, what happens is, generally speaking, when we go to these places and we do investigations, there might be some camera work, you know, or the team will go out and try and understand what assets are there, and that's how you build up that picture. And there's a lot there as well about community stuff, because they will know where the assets are just from living, you know, in the location. So that's how that's built up, and obviously, you know, that builds up as we start to understand more areas of flooding. I think probably something that's more next programme, because at the moment we're focused on this fair stuff. There's probably some work then to start looking at that work, which is then to find out, you know, how do we get more local knowledge more strategically rather than just targeted places to build that up, you know, can we, but I don't, there's too much to do at the moment to build that up beyond that, you know, given the, we've got loads more work than regionally as it is, so I think we've just got to, there's something there, I think, for the 27, which will be the next programme, so probably look at that.
When residents come to you, they do expect that we have a complete full register of all of the infrastructure that is dealing with taking water from an area and going into rivers and so on, and all of the streams and sort of man-made connections that have been made over time, but then they just simply get almost forgotten and left, and that maintenance then doesn't really happen because we just forget about that they're there. And that's the thing that I think residents are like, well, especially when it leads to actual property flooding, they then look to us as perhaps the responsible organisation, or to the borough council or so on, and say, well, why aren't we on top of this? Like, why aren't we over those assets? And what I'm asking is, you know, wherever it is in the action plan, you know, we've got to update and improve asset register, but that has to be a priority so that we actually know where our things are and then how we maintain them going forward. Thank you.
So I think it's probably important to stress that there's quite a lot there. You know, in terms of, you know, from the highways perspective, we've got about 192,000 gullies that are known on the network. That data keeps getting improved as we start to understand that. We've got all the Severn Trent and United Utilities records on our stuff, so we've got that information on there. We did a lot of work probably 10 years ago, perhaps more, going through old records and highways drawings. We've got stuff going back to the 60s of plans, just screenshots that are available on a GIS system that show us all the design plans that were there at the time. A lot of microfiches and stuff like that for planning applications. So there's quite a lot there as it is, but obviously there's a gap then between the stuff that we don't know. And that gap is what I'm on about at the moment. It's being filled by the stuff when we get onto site. We'll start, okay, what don't we know? What do local homeowners, etc. know? And then we'll start doing some camera surveys and looking into it. I think there's a finer gap then of that stuff that you're talking about, which is then how do we do that a bit more strategically, which I think is a further plan. Thanks.
If residents point out to me that there's a particular piece of infrastructure that might not be on your plan, do I contact you or someone, and then hopefully that can be updated?
Yeah, so the flood team inbox is there, and you know I'm quite happy to any information of assets that we can have is more than welcome. You know, so if we get it, you know, passed to us or we find it, then we'll add it, even if it's just a note to say, yeah, there might be a pipe here. You know, there's a record of it. It doesn't have to be perfect information, but yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Connor and Jamie. James, did you just want to come in on the highway stuff that Connor asked?
I think, yes, thanks, Chair. I think the only thing I was going to mention, I'm sorry if I've missed it, I did have to step out just to take a call, was generally around, I suppose, highway infrastructure in terms of flooding. It was a point that Councillor Smith made towards the start of the questions, and it's around the climate change adaptation in a broadest sense. I think it's come up a few times. And to say that it's, you know, that's a national challenge. It's a big issue for the whole sector, for all local authorities. It's well recognised and accepted from government and from the Department of Transport that there is no funding currently available for climate change adaptation of highway infrastructure. But as a sector, leaders are getting together to start to develop those adaptation plans. And in Staffordshire, we are using some of the County Council's climate change budget to start to, on that piece of work, really starting to do some modelling projections of future changing weather patterns, what that might mean in Staffordshire's different weather domains that we've got across the county, assessing the impact of what that means for different communities, highway infrastructure, the risk of, you know, catastrophic failure of key assets that carry utilities and all types of things, and private property or just basically flooding roads that causes obstruction and nuisance and so on. And then sort of start to prioritise what resilience looks like. And sometimes that will be about infrastructure improvements and developing an investment programme to increase the capacity and capability and resilience of that infrastructure. But it will be multifaceted. It will be about community action plans, as that's already been discussed about how the community can help support. And an element, I think, is probably inevitable. It's perhaps a bit extreme to say, but there will be something around social acceptance of the fact that we are going to get more and more of this type of flooding, and the personal resilience to be able to cope with flooded roads, finding alternatives, changing our plans, finding diversion routes, that type of thing, will all be part of it. So I think it is a multifaceted type approach to it. But we are on that journey, say, national challenge, no national funding, but in Staffordshire, certainly using the climate change action plan, climate change funding, sorry, as part of the action plan to start to progress that work.
Thanks, James. And I think we also need to remember a lot of the water that we get in Staffordshire is coming from Wales. So we need to look at what they're doing, you know, outside of the region to prevent all their water coming our way. It's the natural flow. It comes downhill. So whatever they're having, we're going to get the next day potentially. Councillor Smith, have you got another question?
Well, the more we talk, the more questions we raise. Chairman, just some quickies. Can, as a local member, we call on you to have consultation with local farmers on how we look at prevention of flooding? The second thing I was going to ask, you mentioned Severn Trent. My experience with Severn Trent is every time we have a problem that we identify as being Severn Trents, their first response back again is to say, no, 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 it's the county councils. And then after weeks of problems, we then identify that it is actually Severn Trent, but they're less than cooperative. And I was just interested, there's going to be presumably a significant impact on potential flooding when we start looking at the government's demands on new housing. I'm thinking particularly in Lichfield, you've got 2,500 new houses. The impact on the disposal of water and the impact that's going to have, do we have a sufficiently robust system to cope with that?
So, perhaps with the Severn Trent, the priorities have changed now for water companies, okay? Because it used to be that surface water was quite a large thing, but obviously there's a lot of focus now on sewer overflows. So a lot, just a bit of perspective there, that there's a lot trying to get the water out of the system. So I think you mentioned grey water harvesting was another one. So there's probably a lot of work actually about trying to think about how we hold water at source, which makes sense anyway, rather than trying to pass it through a system. So there's a point there I just thought was worth making. In terms of the housing requirements, the principles, it's more difficult, obviously, the bigger the site, because there's more to look at, right? But the principles are relatively the same, which is that you identify where you're going to put the water, you make sure that the development itself is going to be safe, and you make sure that the water that comes off from that site is not going to increase the flood risk to someone else. Now, it's going to put pressure on, obviously, if the number of applications and the quality of those applications comes through, then there will be a resource implication to that if we suddenly get a lot more planning applications come through, or a lot more to look at. Goes without saying. In terms of the actual reviewing on it, assuming the resourcing thing isn't a problem, then it's just going through those steps to look at making sure that it's fine. And I think there's probably a little bit more once you get into those 2,000 home things. There's a lot of partnership working that will go on that to make sure that there's a coordinated effort, because there's a lot more land and there's a lot more probability for problems. So.
Severn Trent and
Sorry, is that Severn Trent and consultation?
well, no, 2 points really.
Yeah.
I mentioned that Severn Trent deny responsibility for everything until they finally find they do have responsibility. And the other question that I was asking was whether we can call on your department to advise farmers on how they can reduce the volume of water that is their responsibility but becomes ours. Yeah.
There is a piece of work that I'm working with on Councillor Flunder at the moment to work with parishes, okay, just to have a look about how we can work together better. And there's probably a piece in here as well about probably different, district and county councils looking at that and how we do that. I'm going to have to look into it because there's nuance around that as well. It's giving a sort of global answer might cause issues. I think I'll take that back and have a look, but I will give a response. Okay, yeah. Like I said, I just think it's a priority thing at the moment. There's been quite a lot of focus at the moment on storm sewer overflows. If you look into the news, it's all about how much. So we've got two things with water companies. There's the water quality and the water quantity. Yeah, and obviously there's a lot of interest at the moment on the water quality side. So there's a bit of priorities here. In terms of what priorities are for different water companies. Thanks.
Thanks, Jamie. I'm going to bring in Simon Tagg now to summarise and finish this one off.
Thank you, Chair. I think a really good sort of debate and questions and comments. Thank you for that. And thank you for Jamie for fielding, obviously, within the room there, as I couldn't be there. I think some takeaways for me is as you said, Chair, the member involvement and interaction with the FAIR projects. And that's really key, because you're quite right. Residents' first port of call will be their local councillor. They know their details, their email or phone, so they'll be on the phone. So I think something to take away is how we embed members' involvement in the FAIR project. I'll take that away. The other one was the get the point on automation, and obviously people want somebody to speak to, but I think automation and AI, for example, can be a brilliant way to get information out there quicker than we probably could do if there was human involvement. But I understand the people want to speak to a human voice, but I think at the end of the day they also want to get the information that can help them, and that's a trade-off, isn't it, in getting that information to people in a good timing so that they can act. Third one was from Connor, the Section 19. The first email I got in this portfolio when I took it on in 2021 was from Connor about the Section 19 delays in his area, and getting it down to 12 months is the goal. And I think, as Jamie said, we've managed to do that on and off now, really. And I think it's something which, again, there are external issues which create delays in them, but the aim is to get those S19, Section 19s out in the 12 months. And the last one was, and I think James covered it when he came in, on the adaptation strategy and the climate change adaptation strategy. And I think we can, through that, have that infrastructure and asset list that which members are calling for, and have that updated and integrated into our adaptation strategy so that we can keep on top of those issues. Because we know, as James said, and as members have said in the room, there is going to be more rain. We're in more rainy periods now that will cause more flooding issues. And we need to be more proactive to get to those infrastructure and assets that need to be cleared out to ensure that flooding doesn't happen in our communities. So I'll take that away as well, and ensure that when we do the adaptation strategy, which is going to be coming to Cabinet in the next few months, that we do include that in that work. But thank you to members. I think a really good session. It was good that we had this as a one-item agenda, I think, for this as well, Chair, because it's allowed a lengthy debate upon it. And I think we'll come back particularly on that member interaction with FAIR, and also on the adaptation strategy. And I think another update to this committee when you see fit would we welcome that, and to come along and do that. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Tagg. If there are no further questions, then we've got 2 recommendations, and I'd like to add another 2 in. So the 2 that we've got is to receive the annual update to the Flood Risk Management Strategy Action Plan, and to support the progress of the accompanying work that continues as part of the FAIR project, the Flood Aware Informed Resilience. I'd like to add, not so much a recommendation, but Jamie, you take away the notes that you've done today and maybe come back to us. And the second one is the one that Connor raised and I agreed with, was a document that contains contact information for members as to what our flood strategy is and where do we go at the first port of call. I think that's really important. I get what Councillor Tagg said about the FAIR project, but it is more about our local, what we're doing locally, and who we're going to call other than Ghostbusters. I don't think that would be appropriate for water. So if there's nothing else, are we in agreement that those 2 additional recommendations are added?
Move the recommendations with your additions, Chairman.
Thank you. Can I have a seconder for that? Thanks, Pippa. All those in favour? Thanks very much, and thanks, Jamie, for your work on this. It goes without saying that there's a lot of work already gone into it. We've all got a lot of work still to do, and hope that by working with us, we can help you on that project. Thank you very much. We'll move on to the next item, which is the work programme. Deb, do you want to take us through that?
Yes, thank you, Chair. So work programme item is item 7 in your agenda, item 5 in your agenda actually. There's no further changes to the document set out in your papers today. The report is for members to endorse. Many of the changes have already been made to accommodate meetings and availability of officers and witnesses.
Councillor Smith, can I ask that you take that, whatever you're doing outside of this room, please?
Apologies for the interruption. So, as in your report, you'll see that there's been several changes. The one that I want to bring to attention is the Tamworth Library visit on the 14th of February. That's an addition. Initially, we had planned to hold the meeting at Burton Library, but that was not, we weren't able to accommodate that. So therefore, there will be a visit to Tamworth Library on the 14th of February for members. And then all other items are included in the work programme. If there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, Debs. I think that's it does what it says on the tin. And I have spoken to Darryl, and there'll be further conversations about reports being pulled, because in November I only went on holiday for a week and 3 reports were pulled when I came back. So that conversation will continue, because I know the members' frustration when we get reports pulled and we come in for a one-item agenda. Today has been good because we've managed to have a good debate on what we needed to do. So the date of the next meeting is the 30th of January 2025 at 10 o'clock here. Connor?
Tina? Yeah, I mean, the agenda on the 30th of January is really heavy.
Yeah.
I will probably have lots to say on highways, as I always do. And I'm sure other members will too. There are 2 matters, national highways and the transformation programme, which are probably enough to see us for one meeting alone, let alone the economic strategy pieces, which are obviously extremely important too. I don't know necessarily what the solution is, but I just feel that that is, even to cover in 3 hours, is significant to do it properly. And whether we consider trying to split that out or deferring or putting another meeting on, but that's very much up to you. Really.
I'll take on board those comments, Connor, and we'll have that conversation after the meeting's closed. If there are no other items on the agenda, we don't have to do the exclusion of the public because we have nothing in confidential. So I thank you all for your attendance today, and safe journey home, and see you all on the 30th.